Sir Richard Attenborough, except I don't have his money. But you may remember at the very beginning of the movie he says the life is so long and complicated, and just in a 2.5 hour, 3 hour film it's very hard to capture it all. I'm starting to feel overwhelmed by my own material here. Let me make a couple of announcements. Let's try to resume the story and get at least up to the Quit India era. Then next week we'll talk about the collapse into the partition struggle, and I'd like to talk about I'll go back a little bit in time and talk about Abdul Ghaffar Khan, because this is a very important story. And then next Tuesday we'll have a complete review, and Thursday we will of course have our grand opportunity to use what you know. Thursday evening there will be a talk on campus by a Gandhi professor from India. His name is MP Matai, and I think I didn't send you a course web announcement about that, but just bear that in mind. It's 7:30 p.m. on campus, I think. I'll get you all the details. I unfortunately will not be here because I'll be down in San Diego at the Joan B. Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice, and I couldn't resist that for various reasons. But anyway, Professor Matai is very knowledgeable about what's going on in India today in terms of Gandhian struggles, and that leads me to a kind of difficulty that I need to share with you. I've been saying that we'll have 164B in the spring, and it looks at this point as if we may have to postpone it. I'm very sorry about that. So we may not be able to have 164B until the fall. It's basically a budget problem. So if any of you knows Bill and Melinda, ask them if they'd like to support peace and conflict studies. It wouldn't take a whole lot, actually, from their point of view, nothing, to get us back on track. But at this moment there is no budget for the course, and I realize that's going to be difficult for those of you who are graduating seniors, most of you, because I got all the lower division, a lot of the lower division people out in your favor on the grounds that you'd have A and B together in 1 year, and now it looks like that may not happen. So I've decided not to take a fast unto death over this one, but we're not at the end of our resources yet. But at this point, that course is not on the books. Yeah. Oh, what's the date of the midterm? Sorry? You might be right, which would take a lot of the pressure off. Sometimes it's not next week, no, but the week after. Yeah, that's right. Right, the 19th. Right. Oh, that's right. Today is only the. That's right. Okay, that takes a little bit of the pressure off. Good, and I did send you an announcement about the Peace Boat, which is coming on the 11th, so that should be a lot of fun. World's only floating university, though sometimes I feel that this place is really not very solidly anchored. But I would like to start by raising an issue that is a result of not only the Chauri Chaura violence on the part of the Indians, where 24 policemen were killed, but prior to that, in April of 1919, the Jallianwalla Bagh Massacre. This was in the context of the Rowlatt Act Satyagraha, which was really the first kind of India against the Raj head-to-head confrontation. And it was a peaceful rally was going on in a bagh. Bagh is a Persian word meaning garden, or this area was called Jallianwalla Bagh. Jallianwalla means a cellar of, and I never have found out what a Jallian is, but so It's the garden of the Jallianwalla sellers, whatever they are. The point is it was enclosed on 4 sides, and General Dyer, who's the military commander of the area, using these Gurkhas or, you know, Himalayan troops who were politically Indian but didn't feel ethnically very Indian, they made very nasty soldiers, and they were just marched in. It was one of the most efficient massacres in world history. They fired about 1,700 rounds and about 1,500 people were hit. Something like 400 killed and a little bit over 1,200 wounded, and the people were just trapped in the bog. They just couldn't get out. It was just like fish in a barrel. And they asked General Dyer what he had been trying to accomplish, and he said, I wanted to make a moral statement that would resonate throughout India. Which morality this was, I'm not sure. But as I mentioned last week, last week, this was really the point at which it became clear that the regime could not be sustained. It could not be tolerated. The struggle was between the Raj, the paramount power, and the Indian people. Okay, so in one sense, this is exactly what nonviolence tries to do. You go into a situation which is one of, and this is a term I don't think we've used before, structural violence, meaning it's, you know, you're not openly slaughtering people, hitting them on the head, but something about the way things are structured brings about a severe compromise of the life of one class of people. Now, the classic, in this country, the classic expression of structural violence is both rich and poor alike are forbidden to sleep under the bridge. Okay? But this is not a hardship for the rich, right? They have a mansion on top of the bridge. The poor, I've seen this even in Kyoto where there are very few homeless people. They have to live under bridges. So the structure of things is prejudicial against a weak sector of the community. So Johan Galtung coined this term, the structural violence. And if you're nonviolent, what you want to do about structural violence is force it out into the open so people can see what's going on. Now, when you do that, people get hurt. So here's the question that I want to throw out to you, hear your thinking about it, and I'll tell you what Gandhi's logic was in this situation. But here's Gandhi. He's trying to be nonviolent. He doesn't even like to hurt little bitty animals. And he sets in motion a chain of events that leads to the death of 400 people. 400 people who otherwise, you know, would not have died, at least not on April 23rd, 1919. And people look at this and they say, you're trying to be nonviolent and it's leading to people's death. And as a matter of fact, that kind of challenge did not faze Gandhi personally. At one point later on, the British sent him a warning saying, if you carry out this Satyagraha, rivers of blood will flow in this country. And he shot back, let them. And then he added to himself, but it's going to be our blood, not theirs. But he didn't scare easy. So he didn't blanch at the death of these people. It's interesting. He called off Satyagraha at Chauri Chaura 3 years later when it was his own people being violent. But he did not even dream of calling off Satyagraha when violence was visited on them. So the question I'm raising is, how are we going to understand this? Can we still construe this as nonviolence when people are getting killed? And it's a challenge. You know, the British said this, look, you know, you're getting people killed all the time. How does it strike you? What is your take on it? What would you imagine? How would you defend this, or are we just going to give up on nonviolence, not even have the midterm, just go home and say this was a mistake? Joy?
I don't think we have to like take every word or act that they did. Maybe it was a mistake, but that doesn't mean
Okay.
the majority of
Okay, so we can say he did make mistakes, clearly. In fact, he called them Himalayan miscalculations, and he claimed that the whole period from the launch of Satyagrahas countrywide in 1919 until the suspension in the mid-20s when he gets arrested, he said, I made a Himalayan miscalculation. I thought the Indian people were ready to carry out nonviolence without being violent, and I was wrong. He made a mistake. Yes, you'll never hear me say this, but it is true. Mahatma Gandhi can make mistakes. However, there is a concept in law which is called criminal negligence, and it states that if you enter into a situation where people's lives are endangered, you're responsible for the damage that accrues. Like every time we drop a bomb on Iraq and it ends up killing a non-combatant, we say, oh, I'm sorry, we didn't mean it. But we knew perfectly well from every single war leading up to this that the pattern is that more and more non-combatants are going to be killed. So it's not like we took a non-combatant and put that person against a wall and shot them, but we tried to do something else and they got killed. But to my mind, we're legally, in terms of the natural law, we're legally responsible because we knew that it was likely to happen. We endangered those people without their consent. So does that logic not apply to nonviolent campaigns also? He knew perfectly well that, I mean, he knew better than we do. We have this image of the British are very polite and genteel, and they would, never handle you roughly. He knew perfectly well that was wrong. He had seen that in South Africa. He knew he was endangering people. So, ... What are we going to say about this? Amy?
I would say, like, structural violence.
Yeah.
You have people that are suffering and dying, and
Yes.
you're not aware of it.
Yeah.
So the point maybe of nonviolent countries is to bring that to the surface.
Yeah.
But when it starts violence, if people see it, they become aware of it, and that's all that you're able to change.
Yeah.
That's how I would.
Yeah. Sid?
Well, with structural violence, you're living, you're not necessarily like commanding any respect. You're not living in
Yeah.
like a respectful way, and so
Yeah.
for Gandhi, I think dying with respect is more important than
Yeah, that's a second very good point, that dying with dignity was better than living without it. Charles Hamilton Houston, who starts the early agitations that led to the pulling back of civil rights, the pulling back of prejudicial legislation regarding travel, he said, I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees, is the way of putting it. Alex?
I think it was also important that, contrary to your example with the war in Iraq, he was endangering them with their consent, and the
Yeah.
fact that if they died
Okay.
for their cause, they had
Yeah.
reached that point when that's what they
Yeah.
wanted.
This is still a third point, that he did not, when people joined the movement, he didn't say, I guarantee you a free ride, and as Alan Arkin says in Brothers-in-Law, you have to stay alive. That's the key to the benefits program in the CIA. He didn't promise them they were going to stay alive. People had died in India. So we have 3 points here. Amy was saying that in structural violence, people are dying anyway, and I want to get back to that in a minute. Sid was saying that death, after all is said and done, it isn't quite everything. It's darn close. It's darn close to being the biggest issue we can possibly face, life and death, our own or somebody else's. But there's actually something that trumps it just a little bit. As Martin Luther King said, if you haven't found a cause for which you are willing to die, you have not found a reason to live. And then Alex was talking about the very important question of consent. It's not like the people in Jallianwalla Bagh said, we're going to die here this afternoon. Is that okay? Sign a release form. But they knew that there was a risk. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, Kevin.
If General Dyer ordered the massacre, then he must have thought there was a threat. Or if there was a threat, because of, not necessarily a physical one,
Mm-hmm.
but just of the movement as a whole,
Yeah.
then it means that what Gandhi and his people are doing are working. It's working there.
It's working in a way because Dyer felt that he had to overreact, and we can take some small comfort from that. And you remember, or it'd be hard to remember because I may not have mentioned it before, but there's a famous formula that Gandhi comes up with in any movement. He says, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. So at least you're getting them from the stage of laughing at you to fighting you, and it's a necessary stage to pass through in order to win. Other comments? Right. Joy?
Well, also, I mean, it kind of shows the British what they are, like by murdering innocent
Right.
people in a way they're going to be like, whoa, what did you do?
Yes, you have to, that is the point of the awakening issue that I started out with. You have to awaken your own people to see what kind of regime they're living under. They have to feel their own oppression. We talked a little bit about that on Tuesday in the connection with nationalism. But even more important, you have to awaken the opponent. And sometimes the only way that you can do that is to, how shall I put it, not trick them, not lure them, but maneuver them into a situation where if they're going to keep on being what they've been being, they're going to have to do it openly. And they're going to, and that will lead them to see what they had done. Now, in an extreme case, fast forwarding to 1943, actually there's two things in 1943. One was in the face of the impending Japanese invasion, Gandhi, who had not had time to organize nonviolent resistance, he'd been in prison most of the time, what he recommended was men, women, and children go to the border between India and Burma, and stand there. And he said, I am not telling you that you would not be massacred, but I am telling you that any army that mows down men, women, and children will find that it cannot repeat the experiment. Of course, in modern warfare, it's a little bit difficult, but I did share with you the tragic rate at which our soldiers in Iraq are being psychologically traumatized by what they're doing, not by what is done to them. So that is there. Let me get back to the other point about 1943. In 1943, there was an event that's known to history as the Bengal famine. The yellow stuff is not me. I don't know what that is. We're keeping the Cathars, though, because we're going to talk about them in about 3 weeks. But I don't know what this is supposed to mean. Okay. The Bengal famine, like almost all famines known to history, was not a phenomenon of nature. It was a phenomenon of human mishandling of nature. And in the present case, and this goes back incidentally even to historic famines in the ancient world, the 3rd century BC, there's a famine in Asia Minor. It turns out it was caused because the wealthy people were buying up grain and hoarding it, not because the grain gave out. The Irish potato famine came about because, yes, there was a blight on the potato crop, but what people forget is that the British had taken all the wheat. So in Bengal, the entire rice crop was appropriated by the Raj to feed the army. And of course, if you ask them, they would say, the army is protecting you. Without them, the Japanese would come in here, so this is for your own benefit. But the fact of the matter is that somewhere between something like 1 and 3 million people died of starvation in Bengal in that season. So you look at those numbers and you see that, yeah, 400 people died at Jallianwalla Bagh. But in Bengal, if the structure is kept in place, many, many more people are going to die. And given the nature of our imperfect world, and it is imperfect incidentally, I'm sorry to have to share this with you if you hadn't noticed this before, But given the nature of this world, sometimes you are faced with a terrible choice where you have to risk a loss of life in order to prevent a much greater loss of life. Obviously, this logic can be misused. People can say, you know, down the ages, that's the way violence has been justified. But the fact is that here, A, it's the consent thing that Alex was talking about, the willingness, and B, you are doing the suffering, not them. So 3 million people dying in Bengal accomplished nothing in terms of political change because they didn't do it voluntarily. But at Jallianwalla Bagh, they stepped forward and said, this is a risk we're willing to take, and so it has that redemptive effect. So this is very difficult. I mean, it'd be really nice if we could do nonviolence without hurting anybody, but at least we're not deliberately hurting someone, but we're creating a situation in which the suffering which is inherent in the situation, the structural violence, comes out into the open and you can do something about it. It's sort of like, you know, if you have a boil and it's got an infection in there, a good doctor will lance that thing and get the stuff out of there so it can be treated. So whenever he was faced with this kind of question, look, you know, we had a nice peaceful country here and now there's all these riots and people are burning cloth and stuff. He said, it little matters to me whether you shoot a person or starve a person to death by inches. It's going to be death one way or the other. But the difference is that here we are taking the advantage. We're taking the initiative. Okay. Any other? I mean, this is a very important point, so if anyone has any other questions about it, I'd be happy to tarry with it a bit. Sid?
What if they wouldn't have been dying? Like, what if there's been structural violence and it hasn't necessarily caused death?
Well, then we would have to ask ourselves about your question. You know, how meaningful is it to live without being in control of your own destiny, without having dignity, without being fully humanized in the eyes of the other? There was an episode in the Punjab where a British woman was assaulted. At least it was claimed that she was assaulted. And of course, this is the absolutely unforgivable sin, that a non-white person should sexually offend a white woman. This threatens the whole order of the universe. And so they had to undertake very severe measures, they felt. And they started issuing what they called crawling orders, meaning that any man who walked by that corner where this alleged event took place had to get down on his belly and crawl. It was like utter abasement, humiliation. And in a sense, you could say that there's only, you know, there's a point at which this becomes worse than death, provided, of course, the person gets to decide themselves. And you don't say, you are worse than death, so I'm going to shoot you. It's not that kind of thing. But you could, there's a time when people have to stand up and say, it's not worth living like this. Yeah. John, did you have your hand up?
Oh, I was just going to say, it reminds me of Socrates, we talked about the other day. Did Gandhi look at that event, or was it coincidental? How he said, let me die.
Yeah, I believe that Gandhi knew that Socrates had willingly accepted the death that was inflicted on him by his countrymen. He probably knew that. It's in 2 or 3 of the really major dialogues. There was another event in Socrates' life, by the way. We're now really getting off the track. Where when Athens was ruled by the 30 tyrants, he was told to go out and arrest somebody. And he just went home. And he said, if the 30 tyrants had not been overthrown, I would certainly have been killed on that occasion. So Gandhi might have been thinking about that too. But we're coming to a point when Gandhi's going to spend a year in jail, and he read 150 books that year. So you guys should not feel bad when I give you a long reading list. Okay, so I guess we were up to the Chauri Chaura episode in February, beginning of February 1922, and I've been asked to write some of these down on the board. And this is where he really starts to lose his credence with the young Turk, sort of the political revolutionaries like Nehru and Chitranjan Das and some of the others. At one point, some people came from Nehru and said, we don't want all of this reform business that you're talking about, Gandhi. We want a revolution. And Gandhi said to them, you people are talking revolution. I am making one. And they were very much persuaded by that, and it was very appealing to them. But when he withdrew non-cooperation, Satyagraha in 1922, they thought it was a tremendous blunder. He was bungling one thing after another. We're going to come to an even bigger one in 1926, in their eyes anyway. So he suspended aggressive program, as he was calling it then, but that didn't mean that he suspended constructive program. And you will see that in general, when Gandhi is thwarted, when he can't carry out a resistance, he can fall back on two recourses. And this is very good for us to know about because in my experience, we get thwarted a lot. You know, you have 12 million people come out and say, we don't want this war. And the president says, I don't have to listen to you. You're just a focus group. That's very frustrating. So whenever he was faced with these frustrations for one reason or another, he would do two things. Personally, he would give up something. That's this sort of strange reaction that we've talked about before, which does not come naturally to our way of thinking. We need more power. We want to get something. But whenever he needed more power, he got rid of something. And in extremis, if this is carried out to the ultimate conclusion, he would give up everything. He would lay down his life. That was his final recourse. But the other thing that he had to fall back on was this constant constructive program, which the British did not understand the importance of, which was not illegal for the most part, and which enabled you to keep the community together and keep them working. Now, psychologically, we know today because, as you know, there's a lot more scientific evidence that backs up nonviolence today. We know that when people are actively working, they feel empowered. It's not the other way around. I feel empowered, so I'm going to go out and do something. It's like you get up off your butt and do something, you're going to feel empowered. Incidentally, I told you about that episode where I took a train into Germany and I was met by my host, and he was so excited that no sooner had he said hello than he started telling me about mirror neurons. That was Professor Spiegel, who's with us here today. So I'm going to share some more scientific results with you pretty soon, Egon, after this class. Okay, so now I will try to stay on the track for just a little bit so we can get through this. In March 18th, 1922, and of course on the midterm I'm not going to expect you to remember the exact day and dates, but I will be impressed if you do. And it's worth impressing me. This is helpful in that context. That's when he had his famous sedition trial. He was tried by Justice Broomfield, who and it was pretty well portrayed in the Attenborough movie, but they neglected one thing because Gandhi actually said to him, if you feel that what I have done is wrong, please punish me with the greatest penalty that you have at your disposal. But if you feel, as I do, that this was the first duty of a citizen, then get down off your bench and join me. Imagine saying that to a British judge. I mean, I couldn't even imagine saying that to the dean. So he really had what in Hindi is called chutzpah. Needless to say, Justice Broomfield did not join him, didn't step down off his bench and join him. It sort of reminds me of this comment that was made about these generals who have come out now saying the Iraq War is a terrible mistake. And someone pointed out that these are people who are willing to risk their life, but they are not willing to risk their careers. So it was unreasonable to expect that Justice Broomfield would actually step down off the bench. But he did say, in my whole life, I have never tried anyone has your character. And though he sentenced him to 6 years of harsh imprisonment, he said, if you get out early, no one will be happier than I. And that part was in the movie. So it's it's that year that he's put in prison, and he reads 150 books. The next event that I want to talk about, so this is Chauri Chaura, it's 1922. 1924 is the Vykom Satyagraha. Vykom is a city in the south, and so now Gandhi is no longer operating in Saurashtra only, no longer operating in Gujarat only. He's moving into the south, so Swadeshi has grown for him, right? He's established his control with his people. Excuse me. Jordan, are you okay? Do you want to ride home? You sure? Hey, go and see if she can. I'm sorry. So back to PACS 164A. He had really worked with his own people, and he started this way in South Africa also, but he now was beginning to feel that his reach was pan-Indian. And that's one significance of this. The other significance is that the South is known as the land of orthodoxy in India. Your really orthodox Brahmin communities are in the South. And that's because the South never got invaded, you see. In the North you had all these Muslims, all these other types coming. Greeks had a little territory that they ruled in Bactria and other places. But the South had always been pretty well enclaved. And so this is the first time in a major public way that Gandhi is turning his attention and his efforts to problems that are within Hinduism itself. So it's one thing to go into the villages and say, we have poverty here and we want to start village uplift and stuff like that. But it's another to say that there are some moral problems within Hinduism. And in the end, you're going to see that Gandhi's efforts are kind of going in 3 directions, if you like this kind of model. They're going against the British Raj, so that's from an underclass to an upper class. They're going horizontally to the caste problems in India itself, and eventually he's going to be offering satyagraha of various kinds to the Muslim community, because as you know, things are rapidly falling apart between Muslims and Hindus in India in the early 1920s. So against their rulers, against elements that he considers to be doing the wrong thing within his own fold, but socially his equals, and towards social inferiors. And so now you're tampering with, remember I said several times that the British kept making the mistake of thinking that religion didn't matter all that much, and they would get in there, they just, we'll fix Islam and we'll fix Hinduism and stuff like that. And that always blew up on them. But here, at least Gandhi is himself a Hindu, but he's starting to tamper with things that were felt to be deeply, deeply embedded in the very nature of Hinduism. And he's going to argue, and this is going to be the biggest issue, probably the most consistent issue concerning him to the very end of his career, and that is the elimination of untouchability. So you have these 4 castes, Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, and he's a Vaishya, by the way. And then you have these people whom the British referred to as unscheduled classes, and whom they had been called by a terrible term, asparshas, which literally means untouchable. And as you know, this was carried out in fairly extreme ways. You could not accept water. from an untouchable. You know, you're dying of thirst, somebody ladles some water up out of the well, they can't give it to you. Yet there had always been an awareness among the sages, those who kind of rise above all kinds of social hierarchies. There'd always been an awareness among them that this caste business was nonsense and that God lives in every human being in exactly the same way. And there's a story, it goes back to the 8th century A.D. about a mystic by the name of Chauri Chaura, who he was a great reformer of Hinduism, incredible philosopher, poet, all the rest of it. He was going down to a bathing ghat in the Ganges, and when he came up, a butcher, which is like the lowest of the low. I mean, they're not only unscheduled, they're descheduled. It's horrible. A butcher carrying a load of meat, which could not be more polluting, bumped into him, and Shankara said, "You have touched me." And the butcher said, "I have not touched you, neither have you touched me." And then he disappeared. And Shankara realized that that was Brahman, God, appearing to him as an untouchable to kind of break through the last fetter of illusion that was holding him to the world. I'm telling you this story to illustrate how two things, I guess, that the caste system, and especially untouchability, because there's a difference. Caste is one thing, untouchability is another. Untouchability was deeply, deeply ingrained in everyone. And the other thing I want to illustrate is that when you got down to the living spirit of India's spirituality, it had no business there. And this is where Gandhi is coming from. So Vykom was a town where there was a temple which had been closed to the untouchables for 400 or 500 years, which of course is not much time by Indian standards. But, you know, there's this sense of tradition that for 400 or 500 years, this temple has not been polluted by the presence of an untouchable. And though Gandhi was not personally there, he authorized people to walk into that temple. As a matter of fact, not only was the temple forbidden to the untouchables, the road leading to the temple was forbidden. And you could imagine it would go on and on from there, but they weren't even allowed to walk on the road. So the Satyagraha was very easy. You just got up and walked down the road. And it was very intense. I know a person who had a relative in his family who lost an eye in this Satyagraha. So the people were really attacked, and it was brutal because the feelings were very, very deep. But in the end, it was successful. And there was a fast against the Brahmins who were running the temple, and they eventually won over by that fast, and they opened up the road and the temple. Yes, Julia.
What is the difference between the untouchables and the caste system?
Yeah, well, the caste system consisted of basically four functional differences. The Brahmins were responsible for learning and preserving the religion and carrying out the rituals. The Kshatriyas were responsible for governing and defense. The Vaishyas are responsible for trade, and the Shudras for service. But underneath that, with no designation, are people who are they're just basically not part of the system, and the only thing they can do for a living is scavenging. In other words, they're what we call today sanitation engineers. That they come along and empty the garbage and the human waste and so forth. Now, you know, the fact is that human waste has germs. And the fact is that people handling this stuff will get sick, and they will make you sick. So there is an element of reality that underlies this. But what Gandhi couldn't tolerate was the dehumanization. Now, there's still another group in India, which are the Adivasis, or the indigenous people who were not part of the Indo-Aryan social order, And he did some work with them, and their struggle has really come to the fore recently. So I guess technically, well, from our point of view, anyone in any one of the four castes is a human being. You might consider the fourth caste lower than the third and so forth, but they're people and they have a role in society. But the Asparshas are there just to, you know, collect the waste, and they should be not only not heard but not seen. Yeah, Camilla?
So what, I guess, I'm confused with what Johnny proposed to fix this. I mean, like,
Ah.
get rid of the dehumanization, but
Yeah.
like, then you left with a group of people with absolutely no, you know, group, like, you can't put them into
Yeah.
other castes, so.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about this some more when we get down to Constructive Programme, but he fixed it in two ways, basically, which is the first way was he had everybody take care of the toilet sanitation, starting with himself. And you saw that in the film. He said to Kasturba, you should empty the latrines. And she said, you know, we don't do that. That's not me. And he's getting ready to fling her out of the ashram over that. That was real. That episode really happened. It came to a sense. So that was one thing. He would identify himself with them by doing their work. He would carry a basket of night soil on his head and dump it into the latrines. And famous episode, 1931, he came to Oxford during the Round Table Conference, and the Indian students at Oxford wanted to sponsor him, and he was their hero. He was going to give a big talk, and they rented the hall. Everything was in readiness, and he arrived, and he said, let's see the latrines. So the what? Let's see the latrines. So he marches them off to visit the latrines. He said, this is disgusting. You know, you've got paper all over the place. Look, you have graffiti. No, probably not, but yeah, that's what our latrines look like. And so he basically said, okay, guys, you know, roll up your sleeves. Let's get to work here. They spent the whole day cleaning latrines. They never went and heard his talk. But he felt that that was his message. You know, not that he would get up there and say some inspiring words and act like a professor. That he would actually, he showed them more with his behavior than he could have done with words. So that was one thing. And then another thing was to try to bring them into society in various ways. Now it was kind of, he was never entirely sure how to do this. On one period, you know, people always came and said, we want to get married in your ashram, because, you know, that's the holiest place in India. So for several years, he only allowed marriages that were in between castes. If you're marrying someone in your own caste, you couldn't do it in the ashram. But if you're marrying an untouchable, come on ahead. Then other years he said, no, that won't work, so he didn't do it. But he tried various mechanisms to get that to work. But it was the biggest issue that he consistently worked on. Just 1 second, Rami. He did not, at a certain point, and it's coming up pretty soon, actually a little bit after Bardoli in 1928, there were a lot of serious Hindu-Muslim riots, and he said, this problem is bigger than I am. I can't deal with it. But in terms of things that he felt he could deal with, this was probably the most explosive, emotional issue. Rami?
Gandhi did approve, though, of, I think, the natural order assumed by the caste, right?
Yes.
He did not approve of the dehumanization
Exactly. I mean, the way he put it in the, I think I've shared with you that famous letter he got from Ambedkar saying, well, Gandhiji, we have to get rid of the caste system, right? And Gandhiji said, wrong. We do not need to, and we cannot get rid of caste. What we have to get rid of is high and low.
So in his ashram, he approved of marriages between caste members and
Untouchables. Well, as I say, it went back and forth. He never was quite certain what he wanted to do with that. I don't think marriage was his biggest thing anyway. But however the mechanism was worked out, what was absolutely certain was the high-low distinction has to go. Yeah. John and then Joy.
What role did untouchables play in this struggle?
Well, at first, untouchables were not welcomed into the struggle. Don't forget the British were, if anything, more caste conscious than the Indians. And it wouldn't do, you see. to have untouchables. But later on, he opened it up to anyone, and he gave everyone, particular tasks that they could carry out. There's a film that I sometimes show if we get our budget back and we have 164B, maybe I'll show that film there, where there's a British Oxfam worker who's helping a village, which has been a village of untouchables. He's helping them build a well, and he's standing up there on a rise, looking down at the workers, and he turns to his fellow worker, his name is Bajpai, who's one of the untouchables from the village, and he says, "If Gandhi were here today, Bajpai, he'd be happy to see us standing here together, wouldn't he?" And the man said, "No, he wouldn't. We should be down there working." So that's just a joke, and not a very good one at that. But a lot of actually this is one of the areas that is improving in India today. It still needs a lot of work, but they're going into untouchable villages and helping them in lots of different ways. So Joy?
Well, I mean, isn't it in a sense unethical to impose some kind of favor on someone else just because it's a societal thing? Like, what if the government official wanted to be a Brahmin, but he can't because he was born
Uh-huh.
into a certain
Okay, we should actually, we'll wrap this caste discussion up for now because we're going to get back to it when it gets to the surface in the 30s and when we're talking about constructive program. But I'll just say that Gandhi felt that originally the caste system was not rigid. And as a matter of fact, he is a Vaishya, so he should be a business person. But his father and his grandfather and at least one of his uncles were government officials in Rajkot. So it wasn't as rigid as all that. And I admit that part of it is the hardest for Americans to swallow. We have a different society here. But the fact is, my father was a school teacher. My grandparents were scholars, yeshiva scholars in Europe, and it just gets efficient after a while. I could have been an auto mechanic or rock star. That was also suggested, a number of other things, but that would have been fun for a while. Would not have added to the development of modern music, I think. Okay, so could we move on to the next thing, because we're now falling seriously behind. Seriously behind something. I don't know what. It matters a whole lot. The next, the years 1925 to 1928 are somewhat uneventful, but in 1928 you have two important events. Actually, hang on, I'm skipping something. Okay. Let me get the two events up here and then talk about them. And then in 1928, the Bardoli Satygraha. Okay. What's happened here is, as you know, from 1922 onwards, Gandhi was in jail, and in his absence, something happened to split the Congress Party. He had been adamant that there should be, there was a Swaraj party that was going for, freedom, whatever they had to do to get it, and there was the no changers. Let me give you a little bit of the background and then move quickly to what I want to pull out of this. Gandhi had adamantly maintained that the Indians should not cooperate with councils that were being set up by the British, because he saw through them. It was very much like the commission thing that we discussed at the climax of the South African Satyagraha. They make this handsome gesture. We'll set up a commission. We'll hear your grievances. Only guess what? There won't be anybody on the commission who cares about your grievances anyway. Well, these councils were sort of the same. They were, again, they were a little bit like the academic senate, where you could get up and talk about issues, but whatever decisions you made were advisory to the government. And sure enough, the government started ignoring them. And so Gandhi felt it was much better to create an entire parallel government and not play their games. This is, you know, one of many cases in which he was actually taking a much harder line than the rest of the so-called revolutionaries. Sometimes it didn't look like that, but that was almost always the case. But while he was in prison, people like Jawaharlal Nehru and Chittranjan Das were coming to prominence, and these were people who had a British education. You know, the Nehrus were from an extremely wealthy family. Motilal Nehru was a very successful lawyer. I keep encouraging PACS majors to go into law school, but they never end up practicing law when they get out of it, so I've stopped. But it is said, I don't know if this is true, but it'll give you a kind of flavor of the thing. They were a very wealthy Shaivite Brahmin family from Kashmir. And it's said that they used to send their laundry to Paris, Kevin, because they had really the best laundries were in Paris. So you know, put it on a boat and get it back 5 weeks later perfectly starched and so forth. They were, in other words, an extremely aristocratic family. And they felt that if they cooperated with what the British were giving them, they would get somewhere, and they were getting tired of not seeing any visible results, which is going to be the issue over and over and over again. They don't see visible results, they get impatient, and over again Gandhi will say to Nehru, "You were too hasty, you didn't believe me." So there develops this very strong human bond between the two men, Nehru being much more his junior. Very close human bond that was never really broken, but at the same time they pulled apart drastically on the political level. And at the end, when Gandhi is inactive and Nehru gets to really organize what the modern state of India will be, he turns it into something which Gandhi would never have approved of or even recognized. But at this point, in 1924, the issue is that Nehru, Das, and others want to join the councils, be on these councils, and the no-changers say, hey, you know, Gandhi didn't authorize this. And sure enough, when Gandhi gets out of prison, he says that would not be the right thing to do. But he's distressed to see that Congress is really splitting apart over this issue. And in the end, to make a long story short, Gandhi decided, okay, join them. Join the I'm with you. You want to be part of the councils, you can be part of the councils. And by this maneuver, what he did was he prevented a split in the Congress party. He felt it was more important at that point for the party to stay together than for him to hold out with this kind of pure concept of non-cooperation. On other occasions, he'll make exactly the opposite decision, and, you know, just about, 10 or so years down the road, he's going to actually leave the Congress Party, so they're free to do their thing and he's free to do his. But for now, he needs to keep it together. His own sister felt that this was a terrific mistake, and this event because it happened at a major city called Patna, it's known as the Patna Surrender. And everyone thought that Gandhi had caved in. And you're not supposed to cave in. You're supposed to, quote, stay the course, right? That's what you do. And he made a public confession of his mistake, and his sister said, this is, you're going to lose all your prestige. And he said to his secretary, probably Mahadev Desai, write to her and tell her that my confession itself was my victory. And he also said on this occasion that people see the fighter in me, but they miss my capacity to surrender, from which my power springs. So, it's like that thing that we said before, that when he needs power, he gives up something. sometimes I like to think that in a violent confrontation between two parties, Party A pushes on Party B to get them to move somewhere. Whereas in a nonviolent confrontation against a violent opponent, you create a pull, a vacuum, a kind of gravitational pull. I know gravity doesn't actually exist. I've read some physics, but you know what I mean. You make it attractive for them to move into a space. And in the end, Gandhi felt that if in a just cause, in a good fight, even enemies will end up as friends, whereas in a bad fight, even friends will end up as enemies. So this is what he's doing here. He's creating a way for the people who did not see his point to join him. That's what he was basically doing. It looked like he was joining them, but actually he was creating a space where they could be together. However, he never lied. He said, you people are as patriotic as I am. You have arrived at this decision by your own lights, which are perfectly valid, although they're different from mine. And I'm here to tell you, thanks, Maya, I'm here to tell you that you've made a mistake and your thing is going to fail. However, I'm not standing in your way. And sure enough, in just a couple of years, it became clear that that was a huge mistake. The British were tricking them, and they themselves decided to go for much deeper non-cooperation. So I think we can learn a lot from watching his behavior in this episode. Had he been out of prison the whole time, he probably could have been working with these people, and they could all have come out on the no cooperation side, and it would have been more efficient. But this was something that a deeply held feeling that he had that this was the wrong thing to do. Nonetheless, he was strong enough somehow to give in, even though he knew that everyone would look upon it as a surrender, as a cave-in. Okay. Then in the years 1927 and 28, just to plug this in, there's the Simon Commission, which was appointed by the British government back in London to investigate things, and once again they saw that this commission was a fraud, and they decided not to play along with it, and they even boycotted the parades and things like that. And in 1928 it was that the Hindu-Muslim problem came apart so badly that Gandhi said, I'm not going to try to deal with this. And he basically himself withdrew a little bit from politics. He's going to do this in a much more dramatic way later on. But he withdrew a little bit, and he said, I'm reading the last part of page 146 of the abridged edition of Nanda's biography. In the pages of Young India from 1925 onwards, Gandhi continued to devote occasional attention to the Hindu-Muslim problem. He had almost despaired of a solution. And here's another thing. He saw the urban intelligentsia split into antagonistic groups, but felt he could not react on it. He had no influence with them. He said, their method is not my method. I am trying to work from the bottom upward. That was the signature of Constructive Programme. So whenever he felt that he couldn't get anywhere with people like Nehru, not to mention not being able to get anywhere with the Raj, he went back to the villages and started to do Constructive Programme from the ground up. Now, here's the way he's thinking of it. He's not thinking, I am defeated. He's thinking, I have an obstacle, and therefore I need to drop back, get more momentum, and come into this from a stronger position. What do they say in French? Reculer pour mieux sauter. Drop back to get more spring. I think they say that in French. And so he knew he had the patience. Here's what I'm trying to say. Finally, I realized what I'm trying to say. The guy was just constitutionally incapable of giving up. Whenever something didn't work, he said, okay, what will make it work? And 9 times out of 10, he felt that going back to the village level so that you had this enormous popular support behind you is what would make it work. There was a sort of delayed result of the Satyagrahas on the part of the British government, and that was the Gandhi-Irwin Pact. But let me, hold on a second, let me lead up to this. In 1928, there was in an area in the south of Gujarat called Bardoli, there was a very intense peasant disturbance. It was one of these situations where crops had failed and the owners, the taluk owners, taluk is a district, they had refused to make concessions, and so the peasants said, we cannot pay these taxes and these rents. Gandhi couldn't go there, but he sent his lieutenant, as he's sometimes called, Vallabhbhai Patel. This is the man who always said, my only culture is agriculture. And this turned out to be a spectacular success. The peasants had to put up with a lot of abuse. Their property was confiscated, and you know, when all you've got is a cow and they come and take your cow away, it's a very serious wrench. And Gandhi is not there personally, but Patel is able to keep their spirits so high that even though they had suffered beatings, confiscation of property, being locked out of their homes and so forth, they adamantly refused to pay what they considered was unfair for them to pay. And in the end, the provincial governor had to step in and they were given redress. So you might look at this and say, okay, this was just very local. It was a smallish episode, but 2 things about it were tremendously important. One was you had, and I mentioned this on Tuesday, this really strikes at the heart of the Raj. If they cannot own the country in a kind of medieval sense that, you know, your land belongs to us, the profits from it are ultimately in our control, and, you know, we're here to skim off the wealth of the country. And there was a cartoon around this period, incidentally, a map of the world with India over here and Britain over here, and Earth was represented as an enormous cow with her mouth in India and her udders in Britain. So, you know, she's like eating India and the British are milking it. And if they couldn't do that, the Raj really could not stand on its own 2 feet. This is repeatedly what we're going to see in the structure of exploitation. It'll be even clearer in the Salt Satyagraha, which is coming up. So this was one important thing, was this was not a symbolic issue. This was the life's blood of the Raj. So to get at them there would make the whole system collapse. And this is, to give you a modern example, I'm one of those who believe that the attack on Iraq was very much an attempt to prop up an old-fashioned system of colonialism. And if you look at what's happened in Iraq, sure enough, every source of revenue in that country has basically been taken over. And Paul Bremer got to write a constitution where this all belongs to multinational corporations under the title of free trade. So I've been arguing that while the military confrontation is going on, you know, getting rid of this dictator Saddam Hussein is one issue. What really matters here is the access to the wealth of the country and the you know, stiff arming of the people who live there. And if we can get that to stop happening, then this whole project called the New American Century and full spectrum dominance will fall apart. Whether I'm right or wrong about that, and I tend to think I'm right, actually, but then I always tend to think I'm right. Bardoli was that kind of issue. Just stop them from exploiting the resources of the land, and they have no foothold in this country. So that's why the British were very, very brutal in trying to suppress this uprising. The other important thing about it was testing the system. It proved at least two things. Somebody other than Gandhi could go there and organize things and inspire the people, and it proved that the peasants had whatever it takes to carry out this kind of struggle. So there's a scholar, Dennis Dalton, a Gandhian scholar, who has brought this really to our attention, and I think he's absolutely correct, that whatever else it may have been, although it seemed like a local kind of issue, Bardoli was the launching pad for the salt satyagraha. Okay, so let's talk about that. It's early in 1930. Things are kind of winding down. People are losing enthusiasm for constructive program. There aren't many opportunities for obstructive program, or what he calls aggressive program. It's not that nothing happened in 1929, but we do have to keep moving on. And this is one of the events where Gandhi himself got the idea. Not like most of the others, he was an opportunist. He waited for people to get exercised about something. He had judged that this was a good issue to fight on. We stand a chance of success here, and he would go along with them. But this is one where nobody knew what to do. People were getting demoralized. They were sort of going back to the same old, and he gets this brainstorm that that probably the most powerful single issue is this British monopoly on salt. So here, now you'll notice actually that most of the climactic struggles are around very basic things. They're not about symbols, they're like about salt, which is absolutely essential to stay alive in a tropical country, or that who owns the value added that comes off your own property, and of course, coming up pretty soon, cloth. So food, clothing, shelter, very, very basic human needs. That's an important element of the way the freedom struggle is working. And for us, it's a classic example of exactly what we're facing in globalism today, because what you do is you take a natural product, and there's nothing more natural than salt. You know, you don't need to add a whole lot of value to salt. In fact, I happen to know something about this because, since you're asking, why am I such an expert on salt production? Well, it's because my son is in the Peace Corps in Nicaragua, and he's working in a little area called Salinas Grande, which, I'm not fluent in Spanish, but I know enough to know that Salinas Grande means big salt. And what they simply do is they construct these pens. The tide comes in, and when the tide goes out, salt water is left there in this pool, and they just let it evaporate, and they pump it into another pen, so the sediment falls out, and it gets to be about 4 or 5 times higher salinity than it is in the natural state, the same as in our bloodstream, incidentally. When it gets that, when the salinity gets that intense, they let it dry out, and you get this very nice, lovely white salt. So it's something you absolutely need. God has provided it in the form of oceans, of which India has a lot of access, and it's easy to manufacture. And an industrialized country comes in and says, no, this is no good, this won't work. You have to manufacture it in these very special arrangements. And guess what? Only we can do it. And not a problem. Don't worry. We'll take the salt water and we'll turn it into salt. And we will let you buy it at a much higher price than it would have cost you before. So this is taking a natural product like salt, milk, wheat, what have you, and commoditizing it, making it into something that has to be manufactured and sold back to you. So I really think that the salt satyagraha reflects the whole issue of globalism all over the world today. We'll talk more about that in 164b whenever that happens. So Gandhi simply decided that this was a huge lie, and the Truth Act would be for the Indians to just go and take their own salt. Hey, it's my ocean, it's my hands, I'm going to make the salt. And in his classic style, he announced to the viceroy, he sent him a long letter saying on a certain day in March, I am going to march down to Dundee, which is about 220 miles, on the coast, and we are going to take salt illegally. So this is classic civil disobedience. You're doing it openly. He even published the names of the 70 Satyagrahis who were going to join him going from the ashram. Where is that? Yeah. In a second, I may be able to read you. Oh, sorry, I don't have this flag, but there's a very nice statement that he makes about when he's leaving the ashram. He says, I may never get back here alive. And in fact, he abandons the ashram at that point and says, we will not come back to this place until Satyagraha is won. So it's a very powerful motive for all of them. And I call this a kind of classically concrete because although salt was in a sense symbolic, and it's treated that way in the movie, it was actually real salt. And now, of course, he could have hired a train or something and gotten down to Dundee overnight before the British knew what was happening. But he deliberately decided to walk there on foot, and it took them about 12 days to get there, which did two things. It gave the government ample opportunity to arrest him, so he's sort of taunting them. It flaunted their courage and their determination in the face of the regime. I guess it actually did three things. I told you I'm not terribly good at math. The third thing was it enabled hundreds of people, indeed tens of thousands of people, to join him. I don't know if you've ever seen Viva Zapata. It's a black and white movie. I know people don't see black and white movies anymore. Marlon Brando is, I'm sure he'll come back, but he's a little bit passé, I gather. But anyway, one of his very, very best films was Viva Zapata, and in it, Emiliano Zapata, this hero of Mexican uprising, is captured and he's being led on a rope down to the Distrito Federal. It takes him a couple of days to get there, and every few miles these campesinos come out of the jungle and join him. So by the time they get down there, they have to let him go because you look back and there's thousands and thousands of people walking with him. Well, it was not unlike that. Let's see, I think I had this description of it somewhere. They got up at 4:30 every morning for prayers and spinning, keeping a diary that was continued for all of them every day. And then they had prayers at 6, and shortly after that they had a light breakfast and got on the march. And they covered, 10, 12, 15 miles a day. And at every town, he stopped and gave a talk. And at every town and every little village, people joined him. So he gets down to Dandin with something like 70,000 people, walks out onto the beach, bends down, picks up a piece of salt. Fortunately, there was a photographer who caught him bending over, picking up that salt. We have that photograph. And then Sarojini Naidu, who was the poet laureate of India, was waiting there with a garland. She put that garland around him, and the fight was on. So that was the signal, and all over India, people started making contraband salt, and not only making it, but, quote, hawking it, going out on the street and selling it openly. They were arrested, they were beaten, people were thrown in jail, and finally a couple of weeks, almost a month later, they arrested Gandhi in the middle of the night. See, he does things openly, they don't. It's kind of interesting. Middle of the night, they came into the ashram and said, is Gandhi here? They pointed to this little bundle over in the corner and said, that's Gandhi. So they said, we know, we'll give you an hour to get ready. He said, I'm ready. I actually have this little bit of a documentary film, a newsreel from a British newsreel where someone is questioning Gandhi about what's going to happen if he doesn't get good results. This is late in the 30s. And he said, well, we will be forced to resume Satyagraha. And the journalist says, are you prepared? Are you prepared to go to jail? And he says, I'm always prepared to go to jail. And so, you know, off he goes. And what the British didn't realize was that this was very well, people were very well trained. That's why the Bardoli was so important. They arrested the entire leadership, starting from Gandhi all the way down. But everybody had orders. They knew exactly what to do. They knew the chain of command. You know, if Gandhi is arrested, you follow Patel. Patel is arrested, you follow this person. If this person is arrested, you follow your village person. If everyone is arrested, here's what you do. And so they knew exactly what to do, and they kept on doing it, and the jails were packed, and the world was watching. And you have this famous event of the raid on the Dharasana salt pans, where I hope you can see this. I think it was something like 250 people came to this facility where salt was being evaporated, salt water was being evaporated, and they just walked in and took the salt. So, you know, there's an issue here of property and property destruction, which can come up, and I don't want to pause to discuss it now, but I don't think this is a problem from that point of view. Anyway, the police were there to meet them, and they were pretty darn determined not to let those people in, and they just beat them to the ground. In many cases, they fell into this muddy ditch with bleeding heads, and at the end of the day, no, that's right, I'm sorry, there was something like 2,000 people came. At the end of the day, 258 people were hospitalized. They just kept it up all day long. They would march up to the gates in groups of 20. Mostly they were so disciplined that they didn't even raise their arm to defend themselves. They were brutally beaten and kicked, and bones were broken. There was a makeshift first aid station that, you know, kind of patched these people up, took them off to a hospital, and there was an American reporter, Webb Miller. Nothing is complete without an American reporter, right? So Webb Miller trots over to a wall telephone and puts in his dime or whatever it was in those days, and he sends this famous message saying that the West and the East, whatever moral ascendancy the West has had, died here today in Dharasana because we beat them with bamboo and iron, and they responded with courage, and we could not break their will, and it's over. And that was the climax of the climax. Within the Salt Satyagraha, the Dharasana campaign is what we call a nonviolent moment. Yay! Some of us have done a film on that subject. That's why I get so excited every time I mention this. This is where you actually force things out into the open. This is stage 4. You know, they've ignored you, they've laughed at you, now you're forcing them to fight you on your own terms, and you win. So it's going to take some years before the British realize what happened and actually give them their independence, but ultimately it's just a matter of time from this point onwards. Very good. So let's do the same thing on Tuesday. Let's, you know, pull out some really key events that we can talk about. Let's go through the rest of the story. And is Claudia here? Yeah. I have some things for you.